What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. 2019 Fantasy Football MVPs. This is the first video in a series I'll be making that looks back at the 2019 season with the goal of recognizing some players that did well or not so well, depending on the video, and also to learn, because you may have finished the season really well, but we can always improve on our decision making. So even if you won, congrats, but there's always things you can do a little bit better. This one's not going to be as much of that. That'll be more for a few future videos we do over the next few weeks. This one is really just handing out one MVP award to each position. So running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, and defense. We're going to give out 5 awards. But the key is, I'm not making the top scorer eligible to win. I'm going to go over all of them, and obviously they are the MVPs, but I didn't think that it would be very fun to just sit here and be like, Lamar Jackson's the quarterback MVP, and Christian McCaffrey's running back, like, sick. Like, no one cares. We all know that they did awesome, so I'm going to go over them, give them their time, but then we're going to go over who the MVP is, taking into account how they performed, when they performed, and also what you had to give up to get them. Because it's different if a first-round running back ends up as a running back 1, whereas an undrafted running back ends up as a running back 1. Taking all that into account, who wins? So, let's start off with the positional leaders. So these are the guys who aren't eligible for the MVP awards, but obviously we know would have won them. Quarterback, Lamar Jackson outscored the next best quarterback by 78, and he didn't even play in Week 17. That's absolutely insane. I'm going to go over him more in depth in when we do the What We Got Right video, because I'm doing a What We Got Right and What We Got Wrong to kind of learn from those things. But this was one of the most predictable seasons out there. I mean, obviously no one would have predicted that he'd do as good as he did, but I said he'd finish as a top 3 quarterback, and he's been taken as a quarterback 2, because like I've said about a million times, mobile quarterbacks are a cheat code in fantasy. So when you've got a guy that's projected for 1,000 rushing yards, gives him a massive floor and a massive ceiling. So it was pretty predictable he'd have a great season, not that he'd have this amazing season. So he was the #1 quarterback. Wide receiver, Michael Thomas outscored Chris Godwin, who's in second place, by 67, while breaking the single-season receptions record, and scoring fewer than 21 fantasy points just once after Week 7. That's insane. Running back, it was Christian McCaffrey, led all running backs with 413 fantasy points, which was 122.9 more than Aaron Jones in second place. If you added Alvin Kamara and Todd Gurley together, all of their fantasy points, all their production, put it together into one person, you almost get to what Christian McCaffrey did. But you don't quite get there. That should put a little bit of a perspective on how amazing of a season McCaffrey had. Even adding both of those players together, still didn't reach what he did. Tight end, Travis Kelce edged out George Kittle, although I think if George Kittle would have played a full season, then he would have had the most points at tight end. Not a whole lot we can learn from that one. I mean, when you've got an elite tight end, an elite quarterback, an elite head coach, they tend to put up elite numbers. So, kind of wild that happened. So, Travis Kelce, tight end 1. And then defense. Patriots take the top spot by 44 over second place and by 61 over third place. Even though they did most of their damage in the first half of the season, they still carried a lot of teams into the playoffs. You know, it's not too often that a defense scores at least 25 points in 4 of their first 8 games. But that's what happens when you've got an incredibly aggressive defense going up against a really easy schedule to start the year. So those are all the leaders. Those are all the guys you should really point at and say those are the MVPs. But that's no fun. I'm going to assign 5 other MVP awards to people who did not finish #1 at their position. So, we're going to start off at running back with Austin Ekeler. And he was taken, on average, depends on the site you use, but in general, around 60th overall, around the running back 30 range. He then finished the season as the running back 4 in PPR and 6 in half PPR, and he was on the 5th most playoff teams overall, 3rd most for running backs. The biggest reason he wins MVP was the value that he provided. Sure, McCaffrey, Aaron Jones, Ezekiel Elliott, they scored more points than him, but they were taken first, third, and in the first rounds, respectively, whereas Ekeler's ADP allowed you to pair him with multiple elite players. And you could have gone RB0, drafting him and Sanders. I did that in one mock draft. I said, let's test out RB0. We're going to take Ekeler. We're going to take Sanders. Let's just go wide receivers and tight ends other than that. So you can pair him with guys like Hopkins, Michael Thomas, Julio, Allen, Godwin, Cooper, guys who had really nice seasons. Pair them with Austin Ekeler, you had a great year. Or could have done the opposite. You could have gone something that I also like doing this year, take some running backs early, then take some mid-range wide receivers, then go back to running back with Ekeler. So he allowed you to implement whatever strategy you wanted, and it would have worked. I mean, even if you picked some busts at running back, you picked some busts at wide receiver, busts at tight end, whatever strategy you went in with, and then you picked Ekeler in the middle rounds, your team was fine because he carried a lot of teams because of where you were able to take him, and it's not like you busted in all of your first 5 picks, right? Pretty unlikely that happened. He was also one of the more consistent running backs, only 3 games all year with fewer than 11 fantasy points. Compare that to someone like Aaron Jones. He had 5 games this year with fewer than 7 fantasy points. So it wasn't like Austin Ekeler was dropping 40, 50, 5. He was really consistent in getting you fantasy points. That's what we want in fantasy, especially from a mid-round pick. So Ekeler wins the running back MVP in my book. At wide receiver, the MVP goes to DeVante Parker. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be saying that, but here we are. Parker was either drafted or either undrafted, not even taken in a draft, or was taken in the final rounds. I didn't see a ton of drafts where people were going out and getting him, but it would typically be in that 15 to, I guess as early as 13 maybe, but typically go in that 13, 15 range, or not being taken at all. But like Ekeler, he had an incredible combination of value, floor, and ceiling. So he starts off the season fairly mediocre, 9-0 against the Patriots, and then 7 fantasy points. But then he was not held to fewer than 9 fantasy points in any game after that he finished. He had the one game with the concussion, but was not held to fewer than 9 fantasy points in any other game. He also gained at least 55 receiving yards in all but 2 games that he wasn't concussed. So very, very consistent. Posted 14 or more half PPR points in 8 of his final 13 weeks. And he was the wide receiver 2 overall. Wide receiver 2 overall from week 9 on, including 31 fantasy points in the week before the playoffs started, which was an insanely important week for anyone trying to get into the playoffs or trying to get maybe a first-round bye. And then he scored 21 and 20 fantasy points in the semifinals and finals. He had a career season, so I feel good about giving him the MVP award. At tight end, the winner is Darren Waller. I don't really think there's another person you could put in this spot. For all the different picks, there was someone. I didn't really contemplate anyone besides Darren Waller. I mean, he was taken in the 18, 19, 20 range at tight end. Basically, a lot of people took him as their second tight end, or they waited just really far for their first one. And yet he finished the tight end 3 in half PPR. He was on the 6th most playoff teams overall at 63, a little over 63% of playoff teams. I'll reword that. 63% of teams that had Darren Waller made the playoffs. Not 63% of playoff teams owned him. So it's a little bit confusing, but think about it. If you had Darren Waller, 63% of those people made the playoffs. Okay? Which was first among tight ends. There wasn't anyone, I don't think, that was exceptionally close to him. And he may not have gone off in the fantasy championship, and he did have actually a pretty low floor at times, but he's a tight end. And tight ends are going to be up and down. There was no tight end that was just dominant every single week. They have low floors. And the fact that nearly 64% of people who owned him made the playoffs speaks to the amount of value that he provided. You know, there were plenty of tight end busts to injury this season. And so the position being weak overall, also experiencing that, the advantage he gave you off waivers is just unparalleled. So after a 90-catch, 1,145 yard, 3-touchdown season, Darren Waller wins the tight end MVP award. At quarterback, the award goes to Ryan Tannehill. Might seem odd that a quarterback that finished 22nd wins the award, but after he took over for Marcus Mariota, he was absolutely incredible. From week 7 on, he was held to fewer than 19 fantasy points just once. And when you think about the most valuable quarterback, not counting Lamar Jackson, you need to consider the value they provided to you relative to their cost. Well, Tannehill was owned in 0% of leagues when he took over. So we've got a guy that anyone could have had in any format for free. And then from week 7 on, he averaged 23 fantasy points per game. Only 3 players scored more than that over their final 10 games. Lamar Jackson, Michael Thomas, Christian McCaffrey. That's it. Those are the only players who outscored Ryan Tannehill over their final 10 weeks. That's absolutely insane. He outscored the next best quarterback by over 15 points while scoring 29, 25, and 24 fantasy points in the fantasy playoffs. There were other quarterbacks who could have gotten the award. I considered Fitzmagic for a while, especially given his monster championship performance, but they all just had more duds than Tannehill. If you just picked him up in week 7, 8, 9, you just threw him in there every single week, he produced. And if you look at guys ahead of him like Watson, Wilson, Mahomes, they scored better on the season, but they didn't really do anything special, and they cost you a lot of draft capital to get to. And even looking at a guy like Wilson, I mean, he had 5 games with over 20 fantasy points all season. 5. And he didn't have any games over 20 fantasy points from week 10 on, yet still finishes the quarterback 3 because of 2 monster games. You know, quarterback was basically a one-man show this season with Lamar dominating at the top. So if you didn't have him, you were best off just streaming the position. And that's kind of what I want to highlight with Tannehill winning this award. You know, you were able to add the 4th highest scoring player at any position for free in the middle of the season. And honestly, that happens every year. Not to that magnitude, but I always say, no matter who they are, we don't take quarterbacks early because there's always guys, late rounds that go off, like Lamar did this year, or guys who can pick off free agency that are going to perform just as well as your top-end players, and you got them for free. I mean, this dude wasn't even on the Titans' radar to start the season, so he definitely wasn't drafted in your hometown league. So he wins the quarterback MVP award. We'll wrap things up with defense. And after the Patriots, the most valuable defense this season was the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I want to highlight them for a few different reasons, but they were taken 12th off the board. So they were definitely drafted, but not drafted high. I mean, you could have basically gotten them in the last round in a lot of leagues. And they were likely dropped after their 0-point performance against the Patriots in week 1. So after that, they followed up with double-digit points in 10 of their next 12 games, finishing second in points, but first overall in the final 12 weeks of the season. So the Patriots started off really hot, but over the final 12 weeks, the Steelers were 1, and they had the 10th most fantasy points of any defense in the last 10 years. The Patriots were obviously historic, but I feel like no one's going to talk about how good the Steelers' defense was this season. I mean, 180 points for defense is quite impressive. So don't discount that. Like, obviously, yes, the Patriots were phenomenal, but remember how good the Steelers were this year, so they win the MVP after Patriots. So that'll do it for the 2019 Fantasy Football MVP Awards. I'll be doing a number of videos over the next few weeks to kind of highlight the season, so be on the lookout for those, as well as a few that kind of look at next year, just a peek. So just looking at some like preliminary rankings for next year. Also remember to check out the FFA Sports Betting channel for some playoff breakdowns. And make sure to hit the like button on this one, because if you made it this far, you somewhat enjoyed the video. So that'll be the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. Thanks for watching.